So when I say the word Roswell, does anybody here this afternoon think of weather balloon? I guess then none of you work for the government. If I say the word Roswell, how many of you think of the crash of a UFO? That's my talk. Have a good day. So thank you everyone. No convincing any of you this afternoon. But I was different. When I was a special investigator for the late Dr. J. Allen Hynek, and so I came from the best in many ways. One of the things he instilled in us was always dress up, no matter where you are, because we're walking on eggshells as it is. And I've demonstrated to people many times, if you go to a complaint department in a department store, if you wear a suit and tie, it gets their attention right away because they think you're a lawyer. Never lost one yet. But I was a skeptic. We were explaining 95% of the cases we investigated at the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago. In fact, the ongoing joke was that with O'Hare Airport, that we were O'Hare number 2. So automatically we were just explaining everything as incoming air traffic. And I thought the same thing about Roswell. The first book had come out in 1980, Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William Moore. I never even read the book. In fact, in 1985, 5 years later, I put out a paper where I stated I just could not believe you could keep something of that magnitude a secret for so many years. How could everybody within the military complex keep their mouth shut about, again, the crash of an actual UFO, the recovery of its crew, the remains, the bodies, that type of thing? I finally had convinced the board of directors, which I had served on at that time, I wanted to go to New Mexico. I thought we'd come down to New Mexico from Chicago, I'm just actually outside of Milwaukee, which I don't like to admit. But anybody here from Milwaukee? I didn't think so, so I'm okay. Yeah. But we thought we'd come down to New Mexico and start tracking down some of the witnesses that we were aware of, who were named in some of the newspaper accounts back at that time. And we'd wrap this up in a weekend. We'd come away convinced this was a weather balloon or something just as prosaic. And for the first 2 days, interviewing some third-hand witnesses, that appeared to be the case. Nothing outstanding at all. Started to talk to first-hand witnesses to the material, who had actually handled the wreckage, the debris. And they were describing it in fashions I'm sure you've seen depicted in the movies, on television, described in the books. But let's just go through the material for a moment and see if any of this sounds conventional. The witnesses are described through the course of our 25-year investigation. Larger sheets of material, paper thin, practically weightless in your hands at the crash site. And yet you couldn't cut it, you couldn't burn it. They describe how engineers back at the base of Roswell took a 16-pound sledgehammer and would pound on it, and the hammer would just bounce right off. Not even a scratch, not even a mar on the surface. There were I-beam struts of the same material, like a pencil, with hieroglyphic-like symbology that ran the lengths of these struts, and descriptions of how they would try to even break the pieces over their knees, and you could barely bend this material. Yeah, good. There were silken strands of material that you could hold a lighter up to one end and the light would emit out the opposing end. Fiber optics in 1947, yes, and yet fiber optics wouldn't be developed until 1970. And then what we refer to as our Holy Grail, the same type of near indestructible material We have descriptions of where they would even toss the pieces up in the air and fire rifles at these pieces, and the bullets would just ricochet right off. And yet you could crumble, you could crease, you could wad it up into a ball, and you place it onto a smooth surface and it would just flow like water. We don't even have such material by 2014 standards. And yet these are the witnesses who handled the material in their very hands. And yet we're told they handle pieces of just simple tin foil, neoprene rubber, sticks, masking twine, off-the-shelf materials that a 5-year-old child would recognize. So what was actually happening back in 1940? 2 years post-World War II, where I always ask, where was the first atomic bomb detonated? What's amazing is how often when I lecture at colleges and their faculty in the audience, they all yell out, Japan, Japan. And you go, no, right here, right, Trinity Site, not Los Alamos, that's where the research went on, but actually Carrizozo, New Mexico, just north of White Sands Proving Grounds in Alamogordo, New Mexico, about 2 hours west of Roswell. That signal, that flash, is still traveling out through our galaxy. It's an intelligent signal. It's like a beacon saying, you got some bad boys down there that are playing with some real bad stuff. Maybe someday it's going to be launched somewhere else. If you remember some of the first movies like The Day the Earth Stood Still and a few others, I mean, that's where the aliens would arrive and warn us, you're not mature enough to with a loaded gun. But yet at the end of the ongoing atomic research at Los Alamos, which was mentioned, and then the very bomb squadron that would drop the first atomic bombs in Japan was the 509th Bomb Group. It happened to be headquartered in Mexico. Oh, okay, thank you. I'm usually wearing a... Roswell, New Mexico, the first atomic bomb squadron. Every individual on that base had a top security clearance. And what would happen in the summer of 1947? The modern age of ufology, the arrival of the flying discs, the very time that the very phrase flying saucer was even coined. Search and rescue pilot Kenneth Arnold over Mount Rainier, Yakima, Washington, would observe 9 crescent-shaped objects on June 24th of 1947. And he would describe to a reporter of the Oregonian by the name of Bill Bichette, who then would coin the phrase flying saucer, not based on their shapes, but the way they maneuvered through the air, as Ken Arnold would describe them, like saucers skipping across the water. That was the advent of the term flying saucers. And I always challenge audiences, go back to any local public library and pull out all the microfilm, the microfiche of newspapers from the summer of 47. You'd all be amazed of the banner headlines day after day after day about the Army Air Corps chasing the flying saucers, chasing the flying discs in vain. Every failed attempt at trying to bring one down. Something was invading our airspace. Hardware, someone else's hardware. We aren't talking about the planet Venus. We're not talking about balloons. We're not talking about as far as even experiments on our own military's part. We're talking about someone else's hardware. And the concern more and more of the population throughout the United States, whose technology is this? Is it Soviet? Is it German? Is it something beyond even the atomic bomb that had just been unleashed 2 years before? There was no question, again, something was flying through our airspace. And according to the Air Force Project Blue Book, there were more UFO sightings in New Mexico than anywhere else in the country at that time. Now, why do you think they were interested in New Mexico? For the very reasons we just cited. the atomic bomb, ongoing atomic research at Los Alamos, all the captured German V-2 rocket tests at White Sands Proving Grounds, and the first atomic bomb squadron at Roswell. And it was a crash of an unknown object, late evening of July 2nd. Craft of unknown origin, as it was called. Rancher would discover a huge debris field about 3/4 of a mile long, hundreds of feet wide. Material he had never seen before, nothing he could identify. He would display it to his neighbors, the nearest town, Corona. Pieces were even circulating the next day at the local rodeo celebrating the 4th of July in Capitan, New Mexico. And everyone displaying this memory material. Did you ever see anything like this? And watching how one by one they're crumbling up this metal, and yet it keeps opening up and smoothing out and running between their fingers. But nobody could identify it. 3 days later, because he was the ranch foreman, his name was W.W. MacBrazzo, he would take 2 boxes of the wreckage into Roswell. Not to the military, but fortunately to the sheriff, Sheriff George Wilcox. And Wilcox, as well, impressed enough with the material, he dispatched 2 of his deputies to investigate the crash. In the meantime, a reporter by the name of Frank Joyce from radio station KGFL calls the sheriff to get some late-breaking news for his next newscast, and he tells the newsman, "I think there's someone here you should talk with." And that's where it all started. And that's when the military down at the 509th Roswell Army Airfield was notified. It's 4th of July weekend. Keep in mind that all the officers, all the base personnel are on leave. It was important enough that they alerted the base commander, Colonel William Blanchard. It was important enough that he didn't just dispatch a couple of enlisted men to check it out. He dispatched his 2 head of intelligence, Major Jesse Marcel and Captain Sheridan Cavett, a counterintelligence officer, in the event it was something foreign. To cover both bases. And the point is, no one could identify this wreckage. And nothing was reported missing. This notion that, well, it was one of ours, it was a top secret test that had gone off course and we just didn't find it. Point is, nobody was looking for anything. Nothing had been tested. If it wasn't ours, then whose was it? We know that on July 8th of 1947, historic fact, the United States Army Air Corps put out a press release where they announced to the world they had captured a flying saucer. Matter of historic fact. 5 hours later, they had a press conference, not in Roswell, but going up the chain of command at 8th Air Force, Carswell Army Airfield, and most of you have seen those famous weather balloon pictures where Major Marcel was ordered to pose with this flimsy foil and the wooden sticks and the clump of rotted neoprene rubber. And it became the official explanation of what had crashed. It was a radar reflector kite suspended from a neoprene rubber balloon. End of story. So the public was led to believe. But to use that old adage, meanwhile back at the ranch, you have 50 to 60 troops spending the next 3 days gathering up every last piece of material. I can tell you the men who were involved, I can name them one by one because we've interviewed most of them. I can tell you the names of the drivers who drove the trucks back and forth. Empty truck out, loaded truck back to the base in Roswell. I can tell you the names of the officers who then set up a secondary base of operation 2.5 miles east of that site where they discovered 2 bodies. I know, and we know exactly where that site is because we've been to it many times. And then, during the course of this, they discovered another, even more sensitive site, about 40 miles north of Roswell, what we refer to as the impact site, where they They discovered and then would retrieve the remains of the craft, about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, egg-shaped. It was more like a pod, a capsule. 3 bodies, and one of them was still walking around. The question remains, after all these years, for all the rumors, all the talk, not only was it really a weather balloon, was the first press release the correct one? Do you have any witnesses to what I've just described? Are there witnesses to the weather balloon? How many here are aware that the United States government is now up to 4 official explanations concerning Roswell? And I always joke, any of you husbands try that coming home late some night? But the government gets away with it. Because every time I do an interview with the press, they cite the latest explanation. Doesn't matter that you have talked to over 600 people, directly or indirectly involved, who say the first one was the correct one. It doesn't matter that there are absolutely 0 witnesses to any of the subsequent explanations, but the press, being the willing accomplices that they are, always, getting their wind-up orders each morning when they go into their newsrooms, they have to keep reinforcing the deception, the lies. Doesn't matter what witnesses say, but then isn't all of our history based on eyewitness testimony? I don't remember any cameras at the Revolutionary War, at the Alamo, or Custer's Last Stand. It's all based on eyewitness testimony, almost every event throughout history. And the fact that how many people have been sentenced to capital punishment for no other reason than my lawyer convinced the jury that I saw you commit a crime and my word was accepted over yours. Eyewitness testimony. But when it comes to UFOs, witnesses need not apply. Anything but extraterrestrial. Because the skeptics will trot out a 100-year-old person and claim he's totally reliable. And when we have 70-year-old people, they're old and senile. I actually had one of the skeptics, the late Philip J. Klass. How many of you might remember him? He was making that very point one time, right to my face, that your witnesses are old and senile. And I said, how old are you, Phil? I asked. And, well, I'm actually 74. Well, Phil, you're older than most of my witnesses. This was 20 years ago. But see, again, the double standard, the discrepancy as far as that, again, facts don't matter. It all comes down to what their agenda happens to be. So, through the course of this recovery, nothing was kept at Roswell. Everything was shipped out for obvious reasons. Many believe that the wreckage, the bodies went to Area 51. Well, Area 51 didn't exist in 1947. So where did it actually go back at that time? So we're going to start with the images. Slide 1. Oh, that's slide 2. Back up. There we go. That's not the cover of our latest book. That's Annie Jacobson's book that was a New York Times bestseller about all her inside sources, former employees at Area 51, S4, Groom Lake, Dreamland, outside of Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. And she had one appendix of a supposed witness who claimed that Roswell was nothing more than a recovered Horton brother Nazi flying wing at the end of the fall of Berlin, World War II, and that Dr. Death, Joseph Mengele, had created a group of 13-year-old mutants to appear alien, who would then fly this wing into central New Mexico, and Stalin had this brainchild idea that it would convince the United States that they were being invaded by outer space intruders. 9 years after the War of the Worlds fiasco. And our immediate question to Ms. Jacobson was, which 13-year-old was flying? And isn't it true that Joseph Mengele was not captured by the Soviets? He actually made it to South America, where he lived out the rest of his life. That there was only one Horton brother flying wing ever recovered, and it's presently at the Smithsonian in Washington. The Soviets never did recover a flying wing. And then that ABC Nightline exposed her source, named him, and he admitted on camera, well, I only told her that story to help her sell books. And 2 months ago, I heard her on a radio show repeating the exact same story. Again, it all comes down to what you want to believe. The actual witnesses or someone who just wants to help you sell books. Next slide. Aerial overview of Groom Lake. I emphasize that Area 51, many people think that even the 51 is significant. Well, it just happens to be that particular quadrant throughout that base area. 50 is right next to it. 53 is on the other side of it. It just happens to be 50, 51. 1955, this base was established for no other purpose than we knew that the Soviets were getting close to developing satellite tracking technology. And we needed to get out away from populated areas as much as possible, out in the desert, out in the mountains, and conduct our additional top secret testing. Next slide. Such as the U-2 spy plane. Spy plane that Gary Powers would be captured by the Soviet Union. It was developed at Area 51. Next slide. The Blackbird SR-71, also developed. Our supersonic, our super speed. I mean, just imagine that this was developed in the 1960s, and it was our super spy plane up until just a few years ago. Developed at Area 51. Next slide. B-2 bomber, B-2 stealth bomber, also developed at Area 51. So you see the pattern, you see what I'm talking about. And it isn't suggesting that it's all based on alien technology. It's just that this is where we've been able to develop and conduct some of our most sensitive, most successful military, surveillance, spy technology in the world. But before Area 51 came Wright Field, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Next slide. This is supposedly what replaced the Blackbird, Project Aurora. Many of you have heard that word. And supposedly not only combining stealth, but that it's also faster than the SR-71. Next slide. Many of you would recognize Robert Lazar. It was just 30 years ago. He went public with the claim that being a former physicist, engineer working at the compound, that he saw what was called the sport model. He saw a number of the so-called captured flying saucers. And what I was finding interesting about Robert Lazar is that, unlike many of our reluctant Roswell witnesses, who still to this day refuse to talk, right up to their very deaths, they took it to their graves. I'm sworn to secrecy, I still can't talk about it. I would cite the current example of whistleblower Edward Snowden. Whether one thinks he's a hero or a traitor, the point is, who would have ever thought the day would come in this country that just for speaking out, against your government, that you would paint a target on your back and you would have to flee to Russia, of all places. And the point is, Lazar was freely able to talk. And to me, that's the tip-off. The fact that nobody stopped him, as much as the skeptics just brushed him off as spreading a lot of nonsense. No one ever prevented him from claiming that Area 51 had recovered alien technology. So you see where I'm going. It becomes a perfect smokescreen. Because keep in mind, the government, the military, is still denying that even such a complex exists. You remember that it wasn't even until the Bill Clinton administration they even acknowledged that Area 51 exists. But there was Robert Lazar freely talking about this facility. And he was encouraged. Next slide. This is what Lazar claimed that he would have seen at S4, the sport model, as I mentioned, as it was called. It certainly doesn't look like our technology. It looks almost like some of the Bell illustrations we've seen as far as some of the Nazi designs. But nonetheless, it doesn't even look that sophisticated as far as many of the known and accepted UFO reports. Nonetheless, this is what Lazar was able to freely talk and promote starting 30 years ago. Next slide. That's the cover of our present book. Inside the real Area 51, you notice real Area 51. And then real small beneath it, the subtitle, The Secret History of Wright-Patterson. That was our editor's decision. Our original title was Beneath the Radar, The Secret History of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Well, the editor decided that we would play off of the success of Annie Jacobson's Area 51 book. And for the first month of interviews after our book was released, all we did was field questions about Area 51. No matter how often we would remind the host of the show, it's not about 51, it's about Wright-Patterson. Well, tell me about this area at 51. Well, it's about Wright-Patterson. Well, tell me about this person. So the title has had its disadvantages. But what we're beginning is where the wreckage from Roswell, possibly other such crashes, have gone, starting back in 1947. Next slide. Little quick history of Wright Field. You might even recognize the two brothers, Orville and Wilbur, and how they started as far as a lot of their actual testing at the prairie hunting field back in the early 1900s, leading up to Kitty Hawk, and the first successful manned engined flight, and how they then would set up their actual training field in Dayton, Ohio. And it would become, as far as eventually, Wright Field. So next slide. This is an aerial viewpoint from around 1947. There were two adjoining bases at that time in Dayton. One was called Wright Field, the other was Patterson Field, named after an officer who had worked very closely with the city fathers of Dayton, when they were choosing whether they were going to shut down one part of the base or not. And he talked them into maintaining both. Two adjoining fields, Wright Field, Patterson Field. Next slide. It's a current day overview. So you see it's almost a city within itself. Has its own nuclear power plant. Next slide. Again from 1947, you see all the different hangars reminiscent of that time, 1947. What was especially crucial about Wright Field at that time is not only did you have cold storage hangars when you needed to quickly put something on ice, but at the Patterson side, you had what was known as T2, which was the engineering branch of the base, which would eventually become Foreign Technology Division. FTD would do all the reverse engineering, all the analysis, all the testing of captured German, Soviet, Japanese, what have you, technology, armory, weaponry. And so it made perfect sense that if you had anything of a truly foreign design, it would go to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, specifically the Patterson side. Next slide. You all have heard of, or most of you have heard of Hangar 18. There was even a movie that came out entitled, it's the cover of the video jacket, Hangar 18, starring Robert Vaughn and Darren McGavin and Gary Collins. The legend of Hangar 18. Well, we started looking into that, for example. Was there such a thing? How did this come about? Next slide. And is it true that that is where all the rumors, all the talk about there being recovered alien technology being stored? Next slide. Well, we found that it all led to a so-called professor by the name of Robert Spencer Carr from Florida, who in the mid-1970s started to actually interview former personnel from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And they all were talking about this Building 18, not Hangar 18, but Building 18. And Carr turned it into Hangar 18. And that's where the legend began. That's where it all started, just that simple. Next slide. And then the book that came out in 1950, 3 years after Roswell, Behind the Flying Saucers by Frank Scully, which didn't talk about the Roswell crash, but rather a crash in Aztec, New Mexico, a year later, 1948. And again, the materials going, the craft, the bodies going to Wright-Patterson in Dayton, Ohio. So that also fueled the legend. And the book was discredited. The case was discredited. Aztec generally isn't accepted as a legitimate crash for the very fact there are no first-hand witnesses, unlike Roswell. But yet again, it strongly painted the impression that Wright-Patterson Air Force Base would have been the most logical destination for any type of captured alien technology. Next slide. Let's cover the book, Behind the Flying Saucers. Next slide. This is Building 18. It's often referred to as the pink building because it's just pink brick. And it's part of a complex of hangars, buildings called Building 18A, B, C, all the way to G. And what's interesting about this specific building is that it's connected by an underground vault to Hangar 23, which has been filled over in the past 20 years. It's been sealed shut with concrete. But nonetheless, from all the eyewitness accounts, that Hangar 23 was connected to Building 18. Next slide. This is Hangar 23. So I'm showing you that these places actually exist. There is no Hangar 18. Hangar 23 connected by an underground vault to Building 18, and this is exactly where the eyewitnesses have been telling us over the past 25 years that the bodies and the wreckage were originally taken to from Roswell. Hangar 23, and that all the testing then, as things were transported through the tunnel to Building 18, and Building 18 becomes part of the complex of Foreign Technology Division. You see how we're coming full circle. Next slide. And again, foreign technology, all the testing. You see the German insignias on the wings. It's a Messerschmitt Me-262. And then putting the American star on as they were being test flown throughout the area. So, reverse technology, reverse engineering. It's something that we all have done since the advent of warfare. You try to get your hands as far as on your enemy's aircraft, their tanks, their ships. In fact, one of the things that often happens over Area 51, they stage fake dogfights between recovered Soviet MiGs and our own jet fighters. It's not on a drawing board. It's not on a simulator. It's where you actually put them in the air and let's see what makes them tick. And I keep emphasizing that because it's the same thing and more when you get your hands on a crash of an actual flying disc, a flying saucer. I don't like the term UFO because all it implies is it's unidentified. Well, they knew what they had in their hands at Roswell. It's just that they didn't know from where, from who, or for why. Next slide. This is foreign technology, one of the other pink buildings, so FTD. It was T2 back at that time. Next slide. You might recognize Ben Hansen. He's the former host of the Sci-Fi Channel program Fact or Fake. Worked with Ben on a number of projects. Ben's become a great colleague and friend over the last number of years. Next slide. And his grandfather, Melvin, specialized in lift technology, hydraulic lift, whether for aircraft, engines, elevator shafts. And before he would die, he's pictured on your left with his son, who I met in Roswell for the first time just this last month. But that he worked at a level 3 floors below Wright-Patterson back in the 60s. And he was always asked by his family, what did you see? Did you see anything that suggested alien technology? All the rumors, all the talk at that time. And he would never respond. He just always would change the subject. In the presence of his son, as well as his grandson, the day before he died, they would ask him again. And he looked at them, and all he would say is, "We're not alone." So in the course of that assignment at Wright-Pat, he saw enough to be able to, in a deathbed testimony. Deathbeds, and that's one of the things in our Roswell books, we have entire chapters of nothing but deathbed confessions. Deathbeds are admissible in a court of law. They are accepted as physical evidence for a reason, because the judicial system has determined that people just do not lie to their loved ones prior to their deaths. That's why they're called deathbed confessions. That's why very often a priest or a member of the clergy will go as far as to a convict in their prison cell, and you have one last chance to get it right. And that's what he said to them. It's amazing how many of the Roswell witnesses, in confessing to their families, would talk about the little people, the little men. And as one of them said, they sure weren't from Texas. Next slide. The rumor, the talk, the legend of the Blue Room at Wright-Patterson, and where supposedly all the physical evidence was being stored, was being kept. And you all should remember a former presidential candidate, former senator. He was a 2-star major general, head of the Senate as far as Appropriations Committee, late Senator Barry Goldwater. Next slide. This is a document that actually proves there is a Blue Room at Wright-Patterson. And as often as they denied it to Goldwater, there it states it specifically. Title, Blue Room, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, 1955. Next slide. Okay, just an artist's suggestion of a blue-lit room and pushing the right panel, what might be behind it. Door number 1, door number 2, door number 3. Well, Goldwater wanted to know. In fact, he would ask his good friend, then he had been the deputy director of research and development at the Pentagon, General Curtis LeMay. Well, LeMay had 4 stars. Goldwater only had 2. But he would ask LeMay, I'd like to see what's in the blue room. Next slide. Advance 1. Another. Somehow I lost the slide of Goldwater. Back up, please, 2. Thank you. Hold that one. But anyway, Goldwater asked LeMay personally. Now, where did Goldwater get any knowledge, any information about there being anything at Wright Pat? Well, the skeptics would suggest that the personnel at Roswell were reprimanded for making the just unbelievable blunder of misidentifying a weather balloon and claiming it was a flying saucer, that it was extraterrestrial, that it was manufactured off the earth, and that they were demoted, they were transferred, and it wasn't true at all. They were all promoted. They all went on. In fact, the base commander, Colonel Blanchard, went on to become a 4-star general by the age of 50. Well, who told General William Blanchard? In fact, we have it in a letter from Goldwater where he states that. So then Goldwater goes to his good friend, General LeMay. I want to see the real thing. I want to see the blue room, the physical evidence. And what does LeMay tell Goldwater? Hell no, and don't you ever bring it up again. And then Goldwater kept this a secret because he was so embarrassed by it until just a couple of years before he died. But that LeMay also added one caveat. If you ever bring it up again, I'll personally see that you're court-martialed. You think he was trying to make sure that he never brought the subject up again? Absolutely. Just the other day, I talked to an engineer at Boeing in Los Angeles who had known General LeMay personally, who had been with LeMay just weeks before he died at his home in Irvine, California. And he asked him about Roswell. And he just told me this the other day because I had heard it from other sources. And that he asked the general, was Roswell true? Did it really happen? And the general looked around him as though he was making sure nobody was listening in. And in good military form, not saying anything, he just nodded his head, yes. And then he immediately changed the subject. So interesting that it's unfortunate that Goldwater never got as Goldwater would say, he was shocked that he was cussed out the way he was. And yet that's exactly what happened. Next slide. This is World War II ace Black Mac Magruder, Marion Magruder. Next slide. Magruder was part of the War College class of 1947-1948. Now, the War College involved nothing but high-ranking officers, lieutenant colonels being the lowest rank, up to general rank. Magruder was a lieutenant colonel. And the War College, and we have the documents, was assigned to Wright-Patterson in April of 1948. In other words, almost a year after Roswell. And in 1995, before Magruder passed away of cancer, he has 5 sons. And each one of them, he told individually that while they were at Wright-Pat, they were taken into a room and they were shown the survivor from Roswell. They were not only shocked because they had accepted the balloon explanation from the year before, but the fact that they saw this survivor just sitting there in this open room with a light shining on it, and he could sense the pain, as he would put it. that we were treating it like a caged animal, and that he would hear afterwards that it died shortly thereafter from all the tests that we were conducting on it. But again, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Magruder would say that the military had a name for the survivor. They called it Squiggly because of the long spindly arms and its body, and that when it moved, it was as though it didn't really have any muscle control. Squiggly. Others at Roswell would use the name Casper the Ghost. As far as the pale, ashen gray color, as far as the size of the head, no nose, no ears, that type of thing. So, again, clearly suggesting the recovery of bodies and their destination, Wright-Patterson. Next slide. This is former Wright-Patterson base commander, General Arthur Exon. Exon was the commander at Wright-Pat in 1964. And in 1947, he was attending the Engineering Institute at T2. He was lieutenant colonel back then. And they were informed to get the labs ready because the material from Roswell was coming in for testing and analysis. Now, why would you send in the wreckage of a weather balloon for testing and analysis? Of course not. In fact, at the weather balloon press conference in Fort Worth with General Ramey, he would announce that he was canceling the resumption of the flight onto Wright Field. That I've just explained it away. It's nothing but a weather balloon with a radar kite. It ends right here. Well, there was an FBI telex that came out at 6:17 out of the Dallas Bureau office, which described the weather balloon and the hexagonal radar reflector kite. But then it made the statement that, quote, based on their telephonic conversation between our office and Wright Field, this information is not borne out. In other words, they refuted the balloon explanation, and they said that the materials were going on to Dayton, Ohio, Wright Field. And Exxon was there when it arrived. And according to Exxon, the materials were tested for their tensile strength, they were pressure tested, they were tested at the molecular level, and that at first, everyone thought that the materials had to be Soviet because no one could recognize it as being anything domestic. And according to Exxon, that after the testing was completed, that the unanimous consensus was that the materials, quote, had to be from space, were not manufactured on Earth. Now, we did not know that somebody else of some notoriety was at Wright Field at that time. In fact, he was the second last director of Project Blue Book, Colonel Robert Friend. And while I was having dinner with Colonel Friend in Los Angeles on one occasion and talking about General Exxon, he said, well, I was there too. And I asked him, I said, well, Colonel, why would they be testing a weather balloon? Well, that's nonsense. It wasn't a balloon. We knew that. Well, then, Colonel, what was it? See, here is someone again talking outside the box. He won't admit that it was a genuine UFO, but he believes that it was a broken arrow, an errant atomic bomb. And the problem is, as I pointed out to Colonel Friend, we didn't have any bombs in our arsenal at that time. After we had deployed Little Boy and Fat Man over Japan, we wouldn't have any bombs until the Soviet Union would detonate their first bomb in August of 1949. In fact, when the 509th Bomb Group were test dropping, conducting exercises outside of Roswell during that time, they were using sand barrels. So the point is, Colonel Friend, how could we have a broken arrow when we didn't have any atomic bombs? He didn't have an answer because he knows what it really was. And someday, before he's gone, I'm going to get him to admit it. I'm going to get him to nod his head at least, yes. Next slide. There's Goldwater. Somehow they get. So, Goldwater, in fact, we spoke to his secretary just a few weeks ago. And she said that even before he died, he felt that he somehow had failed, that he never had his chance, never had an opportunity. And then we have a last letter for him where he made the remark about Roswell, that he felt that it was so secret that he thought we would never get to the bottom of it. Well, I'm sorry, this is still America. And that anybody that would still decide for me or for you as to what is so secret and what is not, especially when it comes to a story this big, I have another thing coming for them. One of the counterintelligence officers before he died, I told this story yesterday morning at the workshop, so bear with me for a moment. But we were leaving his residence, and he was the very counterintelligence officer who was first sent out by Base Commander Colonel Blanchard with the intelligence officer, Major Marcel, to go check out the crash. And his name was Lieutenant Colonel Sheridan Cavett. And I would say to Cavett as we were leaving, I thanked him for his patriotism, his being able to keep and honor his oath of secrecy for all those years. And then I said to him, but Colonel, after he had thanked me, I said, but Colonel, what gives you the right withholding it from my generation and all future generations, for those of us who weren't even born back then? You people have decided for all of us, and what gives you that right? And he thought for a moment, he stroked his chin, and then he went, I never thought of it that way before. But I'm still not going to tell you anything. And that's what we've had to deal with after all these years. And that's what the late Barry Goldwater had to deal with. Roswell was just a weather balloon. Why are they still hiding it from us? Next slide. The Pentagon, obviously, because one of the things that the skeptics always bring up about the press release at Roswell, that it was just a knee-jerk response, that they just made a mistake, they overreacted, they overran their headlights, that Colonel Blanchard just issued the press release because that was the first thing that they thought they should do. Well, the true story is that, as I described at the beginning, when the rancher first reported this to the sheriff and then to the Roswell Army Airfield, this was early Sunday afternoon, July 6th. Colonel Blanchard, going up the chain of command, reports it to General Ramey at the 8th Air Force at Carswell Army Airfield in Fort Worth, Texas. Ramey was in Austin at the time for the dedication, the 4th of July dedication of a new plane. So Ramey's chief of staff, his adjutant, Colonel Thomas DuBose, would take the call. He, in turn, would contact the Pentagon in Washington. It was General Clements McMullen who contacted Colonel DuBose and said, I want the wreckage brought to Washington immediately. Washington had it in their hands by late Sunday evening, July 6th. The press release about the recovery of the flying saucer doesn't go out until noon Mountain Time, Tuesday, July 8th. That's hardly a knee-jerk reaction. And it can also be documented specifically through the Christian Monitor newsletter when they were putting out the telex bulletins, the bullets, the points. Washington was exchanging the flying saucer announcement minute after minute, and you watch the slow evolution through the hours into the weather balloon. So Washington was entirely complicit with the entire affair. Washington was part of the orchestration of the cover-up, of the weather balloon explanation. And part of that was the creation of the straw man, building it up with the announcement of the flying saucer, and within 5 hours tearing it down. Next slide. There's a shot of bombs away, LeMay, as he was called. Many don't know that LeMay was in a strong debate at the end of the war in the latter 2 years of the war, because Eisenhower, as far as Chief of Staff of the Army, and LeMay of the Air Force, LeMay was convinced that they could just bomb Germany into submission, let the Army Air Corps win the war. Well, Eisenhower wanted the Army to march through Berlin and take the country. So it's just interesting as far as when you consider the attitudes, the military positions of these four-star generals, and then how they both were involved with Roswell, because Eisenhower's the Chief of Staff of the Army, also knew everything about Roswell. Next slide. This is a picture of aeronautical engineer Alfred C. Loading. Now, Loading specialized in what might at that time even be considered anti-gravity, because they were working on lift bodies, bodies that could hover. That was his specialty. And anti-radar materials. Now, this is in 1948, immediately after Roswell. And Loading would be one of the civilians assigned to what would become the first official UFO investigation by the United States government, and that was called Project Sign. Now, Loading, within short order of actually being involved in investigating the UFO phenomenon, and having received a first-hand account of what had happened, what had transpired in Roswell just 6 months earlier, became one of their very pro-UFO investigators. In fact, Loading, at one time, we heard this in an interview with his brother, Thomas. They were walking across Wright-Patterson Field. And Loading's brother would ask Alfred, are you sure that there isn't any evidence right here that they're withholding from you? And they were walking by a particular hangar, and according to his brother Tom, he pointed over and he says, I keep hearing they have bodies over in that hangar. Now, I don't know if it was 23 or another one, but again, this is 48. It's still the buzz, it's still the talk on the base about it wasn't the weather balloon, that there were bodies recovered at Roswell, and they weren't from here. Next slide. This is General Nathan Twining, another four-star general. He was head of the Air Material Command at Wright Field in 1947. And next slide. This is General George Shulgin, who was at the Pentagon. He was the Deputy Director of Intelligence of the Air Intelligence Requirements Division, the engineering department, in other words, handling as far as all the materials. And they had a network throughout the world where, again, we were spying, we were monitoring, we were making sure that when the Soviets would detonate their first bomb, that we would be the first to know about it. Well, anyway, General Shulgin received a request from J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. What's all this talk about these flying saucers? They weren't yet called UFOs, about these flying saucers. Why isn't the FBI being assigned and being provided access to the reports? The FBI needs to be involved. I want a report on my desk as soon as possible. So he made the request to General Shulgin, who then made the request to General Twining at Air Material Command at Wright Field. In 1947, just 2 months after, September of 47, Twining, next page, next slide. Oh, you jumped to. Twining would sign off on a 3-page letter, and many of you probably have heard about it. It's called the Twining Letter, in which he stated, flying saucers, the phenomena is something real and not visionary or fictitious. It went on to describe the shape being disc shape, 30 to 50 feet in diameter, circular, able to outmaneuver and outperform anything we had. And the who signed off on it were a whole number of engineers from T2 who at that time were testing the Roswell material. If we're to believe that they were only making this decision on sightings, on a balloon report from Roswell, a balloon recovery, and within 2 months, General Twining is sending a letter to General Shulgin that flying saucers are real and they're not ours, how were they able to make that decision as quickly as they did unless they had actual physical evidence in their hands? And that's the point. It's hardly based on people's sightings of lights in the sky, flying disc reports. They had to know based on the physical evidence. So Project Sign would then conclude their report, sending it up to then Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Hoyt S. Vandenberg, pictured here. And Vandenberg, reading the report and seeing that the conclusion was the phenomena was interplanetary, that flying discs were not of this earth. This is at the end of 1948. And Vandenberg ordered the report burned, destroyed. So we've never seen Project Sign. Interestingly enough, the next project would be called Project Grudge. And they cleared out most of all the pro-UFO researchers and investigators, replaced them with all anti-UFO, anti-alien technology researchers. And Project Grudge's conclusion in 1949 was that it was all hallucinatory. People were just seeing things like pink elephants and over-imbibing and had nothing to do with physical aircraft in the air. Next slide. Well, there was a general by the name of Charles Cabell at the Pentagon. And we have a transcript of the meeting that he had in Washington, that he had at the Pentagon, where he literally is shouting at the Grudge personnel about being lied to. I'm tired of you people lying to me. I want the truth about the flying saucers. And he's pounding his fist on the table. I want the truth. And Captain Edward Ruppelt was then assigned as the new director of Project Grudge, which completely turned it around. And then he would become, within a year, the director of the next project, which would be the most famous of the three, Project Blue Book. And it was a serious investigation for the year and a half that Ruppelt was in charge. And they treated the subject seriously, and they investigated the subject seriously, and they treated the witnesses with respect and dignity. And they went out of their way to get to the bottom of the UFO phenomena. In fact, Ruppelt was the one who would coin the very phrase, the very term, unidentified flying objects. So Ruppelt created UFO. Next slide. It's a cover of his book, Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, that he wrote after he left Blue Book. The first version of the book, oh, you mean there's another version? Yes, there are two versions. The first version was pro-UFO. Ruppelt's conclusions were that it was something manufactured off the earth. Well, I guess the Pentagon didn't like it because he was forced to rewrite it. And the second version is entirely anti-UFO. Once again, freedom of the press in the United States of America. Yes, I have a copy of the first version. I have a copy of the second. It's the compare the two. It's night and day. Night and day. Next slide. Here's a picture of Ruppelt standing in the middle, looking down over General John Samford, who was Chief of Staff of the Air Force at that time. And to his left, your left, is then Major General Roger LeMay. And LeMay was the orchestrator of the weather balloon press conference at Fort Worth, Texas. LeMay was the one who ordered Major Jesse Marcel from Roswell to pose with the substituted weather balloon. LeMay was the one who was photographed with his chief of staff, Colonel Thomas DuBose, with the same balloon wreckage. When we interviewed and Brigadier General Thomas DuBose, Ramey's chief of staff, DuBose told us the balloon was a hoax. We were ordered to substitute the balloon for the real material. He signed a sworn affidavit. He did a video deposition. You didn't hear about it in the press, did you? We went to USA Today. We went to New York Times. We went to the Chicago Trib, LA Times. We have a brigadier general saying that Roswell balloon explanation was a complete hoax, and here's one of the participants. And just like Edward Ruppelt being ordered to write a second version of his book, DuBose was also told, you spoke out of turn, you're not to say another word about this. And for the next year of his life, he wouldn't talk about it. Next slide. Oh, I should point out that General Ramey, who presented the balloon explanation, was nicknamed by the Pentagon and Project Blue Book their saucer man, when he should have been called their balloon man. But yet he was called their saucer man. Isn't that interesting? No. Let's skip so we can. H.P. Robertson, Caltech astrophysicist, conducted as directed by the CIA in 1953, again sponsored through Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a 14-day investigation of the UFO phenomenon. And what's interesting is that this was just within weeks after what had happened over Washington, D.C., over 2 nights, a week apart, when formations of UFOs buzzed the White House. The headlines even beat out the Republican convention at that time. Aircraft were scrambled from Andrews Air Force Base, and again, the UFO situation was getting out of hand. And the CIA stepped in and decided that they were going to start discrediting not the reports, but the witnesses. So what the Robertson panel, as directed by the CIA, decided from that point on, that Project Blue Book was to investigate the witnesses and discredit them. That the UFO reports would be investigated. As their scientific director, my former scientific director, Dr. Jalen Hynek, that all the hardcore cases were going above Blue Book. They were not going to Blue Book. Washington was investigating the true cases. So, next slide. And then as the Blue Book became more and more a PR front, that's all it was. It was not an actual investigation. And there were sightings such as Socorro, New Mexico, the Lonnie Zamora landing, one of the most famous of all UFO cases. The Dexter Ann Arbor sightings over as far as in Michigan in 1966. Other sightings at that time where the Air Force realized that they again were losing control. The press was starting to ask hard questions. So they decided they were going to appoint a civilian study group headed by astrophysicist Dr. Edward Condon, the University of Colorado at Boulder. The famous Condon Committee would convene in 1966 and release their findings at the end of 1968. 700-page report. And Condon's committee would conclude that the investigation of the UFO phenomenon had never produced anything of a scientific nature. There was no reality to the phenomenon, and that further investigation would not be warranted, was no longer necessary, and strongly urged that the Air Force would drop their Project Blue Book. Now, what's interesting about Edward Condon was we've had inside sources through the years who conducted testing and analysis of the wreckage, not only at Wright Field, Wright-Patterson, but also Battelle Institute, Battelle National Laboratories, Hughes Aircraft, Rand Corporation, General Electric, and the Bureau of Standards in Washington. You know who the director of the Bureau of Standards was in 1947? Edward Condon, the director of the Condon Committee, who had just said that further investigation of the UFO phenomenon was no longer warranted. So by the end of 1969, the Air Force shuts down Project Blue Book, end of their official UFO investigation. And as any of you know, you could contact any Air Force facility, say you have a UFO report, and they'll immediately refer you to your local law enforcement and tell you that we stopped investigating UFOs with the closing of Blue Book back in 1969. Next slide. This is a copy of the study, scientific study of unidentified flying objects. Even the United States Academy of Science signed off on it, approved it, accepted its findings. And most people, and barely any reporters, ever read through the 700 pages. What's interesting is that the Air Force Project Blue Book, their explanation rate was 87%. They explained 87% of the cases they investigated. The Condon Committee failed to explain 25% of the cases they investigated, but they were all buried within the report. There's nothing there, but there's 25% of these cases we can't figure out. But they were just counting on the fact that out of 700 pages, nobody would notice. We noticed. Next slide. Dr. James McDonald, University of Arizona in Phoenix, the other famous astrophysicist, was one of, if not the most outspoken critic of not only the Air Force, but also the Condon report. And he would champion the subject to the point that there would be hearings in Washington, again, trying to finally and once and for all get out of the UFO business. And McDonald would wind up committing suicide in an Arizona desert. Some colleagues believe that it was very suspicious. Others say it was because of his divorce at that time, but nonetheless, it all happened within that time frame. And I, for one, can only say that if Dr. McDonald would have lived, we may all have the answers by now. He was that relentless. He was that driven. He was 100% convinced that we were being visited by an intelligence from off the planet. Next slide. This is Battelle Institute in Columbus, Ohio. Just across the river, just down the road from Wright-Patterson. Next slide. I had the tremendous honor in January of 1994. I was the first UFO researcher ever invited to speak at Battelle Institute. I spoke at their theater. It was a night of an ice storm, and it was the first time they ever filled up the entire theater, over 800 people. And all the Battelle scientists in the front rows all taking notes. Next slide. Because, as we had discovered, this is John Spencer Center. And he had talked to a colleague of ours, excuse the quality of the picture, but he had talked to a colleague of ours years before about having tested and examined wreckage from a flying saucer. And then we discovered, next slide, that there was a report that was labeled Status Report Number 2 that came out at the end of 1948 about Wright-Patterson's assigning Battelle Institute with the research project of developing, now remember how I described the memory at Roswell. Their terminology was self-healing metal. Now this report, report number 2, which we have a copy of, was released at the end of 1948. Roswell was July of 1947. Battelle denied they had a copy of the report. Wright Pat denied. We went back and forth through Freedom of Information. Finally, we acquired a copy from Battelle. And who was the author of the report? Dr. Center, who I just mentioned a moment ago, who had told a colleague that he had tested and examined wreckage from a flying saucer years before. Now, the status report talks about their testing and their development of a material, you see a picture of it here, called nitinol. It's a combination of nickel and titanium. And through the Naval Ordnance Lab, nitinol. And it's slightly flexible. You can buy it by the sheet. It's used primarily in hospitals for surgical equipment. Once in a while you see as far as flexible frames, as far as on glasses, that's nitinol. You can go on YouTube and you'll see demonstrations where they'll take a sheet of it and you dip it into hot water and you pull it out and it's like taffy. And you can twist it and bend it and crunch it up, but then you have to dip it into cold water and withdraw it where it again assumes its normal shape and strength characteristics. Roswell was right before your eyes in 1947, but it still demonstrates within months after Roswell their keen interest in such material. Self-healing metal, nitinol, which actually became patented in the early 1960s. Next slide. The one person who got us involved as far as crash retrievals, who happened to live also just down the road from Wright-Patterson, was the late Leonard Stringfield. Dear friend, one of our books is even dedicated to Len. And Len was the one who started to first accumulate all the eyewitness testimony, not only of Roswell, other crash retrieval incidents, but specifically witnesses at Wright-Patterson who were becoming anonymous whistleblowers, that there were bodies being stored there, that there were as many as 10 levels beneath the base proper, that there were autopsies performed at Wright-Pat, that bodies were kept in cold storage. And so Len started to accumulate and he started to share this information with us more and more. And this is where the investigation of the actual crash retrieval incidents started in the late 1970s. And I didn't believe it until the late 1980s. As I said at the beginning, I was a complete skeptic. Again, I just couldn't believe, as I've described, something that big could be kept secret. And I kept wondering why, if such information was out there, why we weren't hearing it. And as I described to you, having a brigadier general such as Thomas DuBose, who did go public, and the press wouldn't listen to him, so then how else would we hear about it? And when Major Marcel, the intelligence officer of Roswell, the first to arrive on the scene, who saw all the wreckage, all the debris, and as a lieutenant colonel, when he broke his oath of secrecy, when he was dying of emphysema in 1978, and he went public, the only publication in the country that even touched his story was the National Enquirer. So I saw the pattern. I realized that no wonder we're not hearing anything about it, because our watchdogs at the gate are once again doing exactly what Big Brother is telling them to do. They're not reporting the news, they're not reporting the truth, they're just taking orders and making the news and writing the news and creating the news. It's amazing what the media can do with a survey, because that's all it comes down to, what the people believe and how they... I had a CNN, she used to be head of the news department at CNN, her name was Judy Wolf. And she told me that they always had a select group of people at CNN whenever they wanted to get specific results from a poll. So, once again, journalism at its best. So, next slide. This would be based on a drawing of one of the doctors from Wright-Patterson, of one of the autopsies of what he witnessed. And you see the classic, the larger disproportionate head, the spindly body. Remember what I said about Colonel Magruder's description and the name squiggly in conjunction with what he saw at Wright-Pat in April of 1948. And then we finally talked to a still surviving doctor by the name of Dr. Leon Kassarian, who specializes in crash investigation. In fact, he worked with Apollo, because where was NASA conducting their crash research but Wright-Patterson Air Force Base? And Kassarian was working specifically with the effects of long-term zero gravity on the physiological body of human beings. And Kassarian would tell a colleague of ours at Wright-Pat that it was their contention that the longer a human being would be in zero gravity in outer space, they would start to resemble that. It's on the other side. I know that's often the description about there not being an opposable thumb, but all the witnesses we have from Roswell say there was a thumb. So, next slide. That's a more recent artist rendition of what we're the legs are too long. That has been corrected. The legs actually, I don't have the pointer, I left it, but should be at the knee joints. That's where the feet should be. So that was just his mistake. But again, that even the consideration within our space program that's how we would start to appear. Next slide. How much time do we have? Another hour? No, I'm just asking. 10 minutes, I see 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever I want. I'm dying up here. It is hot. I'm sorry. See, they're telling me to leave. They cut my mic. Okay. In 1979, a dental technician by the name of John Musgrove. He at one time had worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He still works outside of Dayton. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. You could have opened it for me. Excuse me. You open. It's a little hard with one hand. Thank you. Appreciate it. Oh no, I got an hour to go. Well, Musgrove was working in his dental lab, and he was working on the 4th floor, and his boss came in with this relief, with this cast of this mandible, this lower jawbone. And he thought it was nothing more than a dental as far as impression. And he was told that he was to make a duplicate and that his boss would be by the next day to pick it up. Well, he went to the sink to rinse it off, and what he first observed was there was no fresh blood, saliva, and as he washed it, he realized, my God, this is bone. This is real. And there are no teeth. It's just all gum tissue. It's got a couple of posts. The actual, you see the shape of it. And the image is off the actual It's compared to a human, the upper right hand, lower jawbone, lower mandible on your right, and then the actual impression is right next to it. And you see that it's more V-shaped, comes to a point. No teeth, much smaller. Well, how did he manage to keep a copy of it? Well, he would make the duplicate. His boss would retrieve it. And he said, well, I need the prescription form, which is standard procedure. And he says, well, you didn't do anything. You didn't see anything, and you're not going to say anything, which he thought was even all the more strange. And then he left with it, but he turned around and he went back to his work table and took the impression, crumbled it up, and tossed it in the wastepaper basket, leaving with the original mandible and the now duplicate. So he left, and Mosgrove followed from a distance, went down to the front lobby, and he watches as his boss, in the parking lot, meets with two Air Force officers. And the one colonel he immediately recognizes as someone he had served with at Wright-Patterson, just down the road. They put both into a briefcase, they shake hands, they walk away, and his boss just walks to the parking lot. And he immediately, Mosgrove, races back to the lab, grabs the crumbled relief from the trash, and then reassembles it, puts it back together again, casts his own new impression, and then locks it up in a bank security box for the next 30 years. We have a copy of it now at the museum in Roswell. We've had in a display with Mosgrove the whole story, the comparison as far as his relief, and then a human as far as jawbone, mandible. We've had 6 different paleontologists look at it, and down to each one they say that it is not human, it is not primate, it is not animal. One even went so far as to say it's not human. It's not from this earth. And again, the source, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So you see where we just keep coming back, the trail. And even to a colonel who told us just a couple years ago that everything was moved out of Wright-Pat in the early 80s. And he says we had a hell of a time moving everything out through that city because we were doing it after midnight each night, because people would have became wise to the fact that something big was going on. But he says we got away with it. So where do I believe the bodies are right now, for example? Where do I believe that the remains, the wreckage, are being still tested, are being kept, being housed? I asked this question yesterday in the workshop, but how many have seen the first Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark? Just about all of you. What's the final scene in the movie? The warehouse. What's the opening as far as scenes in the last Indiana Jones? The warehouse. And what's in the warehouse? Roswell. When I first saw that movie, around 1980, Dr. Hynek was already meeting with Steven Spielberg, planning on doing the sequel to Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Close Encounters of the Third Kind is based on the classification of UFO sightings by Dr. Hynek. You have close encounter, first kind, second kind, third kind, nocturnal light, radar, daylight disk, that type of thing. And so Hynek was a consultant on the picture. He's got his 7-second cameo as far as after the landing of the mothership at the end. That was my boss. And I would always ask him, next time you see Spielberg, you ask him what he was inferring, what he was implying by that closing scene. And months would pass. And I get a phone call one afternoon, and it's my boss. It's Dr. Hynek. And he says, I just had breakfast with Stephen. We're talking about the next movie, and I asked him your question. And he said, I knew somebody would figure it out. That's exactly what I believe they did with the recovery of the craft from Roswell. If you can't figure it out, all you can do is crate it up and hide it. And so that was even after the fact that for all these years, I still remain of the position it's a cover-up of ignorance. They still can't figure out the technology. And I can see that, for example, there was a flight mechanic at Building P3, Building 84, which was a B-29 hangar where all the materials and the bodies transited through at Roswell back at the time of the crash. His name was Sergeant William Ennis. And he said to me just before he died, he said, Don, I know I don't have much time, but you got to make me a promise. You find out how that damn thing flew. It didn't have a moving part on it. And so screenwriter Tracy Torme uses, the analogy. Just imagine if you had something as simple as a toaster, and you could teleport it back in time, say back to the Middle Ages, and they might be able to disassemble and even put it back together again. But if you can't plug it in, you can never get it to work. So as of this day in 2014, I still remain convinced they still can't find the on button. That's why we're still flying rockets and jets and driving internal combustion cars and, basically, for all of our great technology, we haven't had that quantum leap. We haven't had, especially if the technology is that advanced, how do you bridge that gap? So I am more apt to believe that it is just all hidden away, and the hope that someday maybe we'll bridge that gap. We'll find where that hidden button is. And I'll end with this. One of the last directors at Foreign Technology that Hynek worked with is the late Colonel George Weinbrenner. And Weinbrenner was assigned to assist filmographer, videographer, Robert Emenegger, who was the author of UFOs Past, Present, and Future, to do a documentary for the Air Force. And Emenegger would meet with Weinbrenner at Wright-Patt at his office to discuss plans for the documentary. Well, the Air Force squelched the deal. It never happened. It probably would have been pro-UFO, and it's the last thing that the Air Force was going to admit. Well, anyway, when Weinbrenner was dying in San Antonio in 2006, he had a message sent to Bob Emenegger, which was, Bob, we have 5 bodies in Utah. Well, what Weinbrenner didn't know was that we already had a first-hand witness by the name of Colonel Robert Mountdragon, who was stationed in Utah in 1957, where he saw 2 of the bodies from Roswell. So I'm sitting with Colonel Robert Friend in Los Angeles last June, so just a year ago. And I say, Bob, if you did have alien bodies here in 2014, then 2013, where would they be? Where would you have them stored? What would be the most likely facility? Well, he went, why, Dugway. Dugway. That's the biological research facility in Utah. So our next plan is to start knocking on the door at Dugway. I know good luck, but I'm going to end on this. 2 years ago, Peacock, NBC, Lester Holt, who we had worked with, and he's the weekend anchor on NBC Nightly News. We were asked by NBC to arrange for them to take a film crew on the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And we've never had a problem before. But this time, we wanted to find some evidence of some of the lower levels, which they still deny, that there are any lower levels. No underground vaults, tunnels, chambers, nothing. So I got turned down over and over again, and they were having me jump through hoop after hoop after hoop. I was going through Air Force Entertainment in Hollywood, through the Public Relations Department at the base. And I never had such a problem before. So one of my very close friends is a former deputy commander at Wright-Pat. His name is Colonel Jeffrey Thau. And I call him and I say, Jeff has an office at Wright-Pat and an office at the Pentagon. I said, Jeff, they're not letting me on the base. Get me on the base. NBC'd like to bring a film crew on the base. What are you hiding? Take care of it, Don. I'll get back to you in a few days. Colonel Thau would call me up and he would say, Don, I have a new quote for your next book. I just got out of the office with Base Commander Colonel Richard Stacy. And Colonel Stacy said to me, Jeff, I don't care if you have 4 stars. Don Schmidt is not getting on this base. And I'm very proud of that.